Welcome back to another edition of Liberty Lately. Dexter Henry, Madeline, Kenney here with you. It's been a very busy week in Liberty news. We know Sandy Brondello not returning as head coach of the Liberty. And today, Jonathan Kolb, the general manager, he spoke to the media. Maddie got a chance to ask some questions, talk to him. She's written about it. And on this episode, we're going to react to what Jonathan Kolb had to say. And then also we're going to try to look at the coaching candidates and the next steps for this team. But Maddie, how are you doing? It's been a busy week. The offseason started with a bang for you.
Yeah, here I am thinking that I'm going to be off on Tuesday. I'm like ready to just chill, do nothing. And then all of a sudden I get text, I get emails, I get calls. I'm like, oh, something's happening. But you know what? That's the life of being a sports reporter. It's like the days that you least expect that things are going to happen. They always happen at like the most worst times, like when you're like at the gym or away from your phone for whatever reason. That's when news always breaks, it seems.
I think we could start off by saying, please, you and I talked about this, and we talked about this just when we recorded the previous time we recorded on Sunday about this, and was like, hey, there's a possibility there could be some changes with this team. There's possibility that Sandy might not be back, some other roster changes. We had no idea how it was going to look. I think one of the things that stood out to me today when I looked at what Jonathan Kolb said, Maddie, was there's kind of a message of like, okay, the Liberty, whatever our standard is, we're not good enough, right? And we need to get better. He said the team needs to evolve, innovate, adapt. Those words were used multiple times. How do we look at the Brondello firing and interpret those words, evolve, innovate, adapt, in terms of Sandy's coaching style? What does that mean in terms of her coaching style and how they want to move forward?
Yeah, because we're talking about adapting from a team that won a championship last year and was absolutely hampered by injuries all season that resulted in a first round exit. I mean, look, Sandy's firing did not come down to this season alone. It was something that they had been considering for a long time. It was a thorough examination, is what Jonathan described it as. He said that it wasn't reactive, it was proactive, all of these things. And so I think the biggest thing with Sandy is that the Liberty have always been kind of on the cutting edge in this current era under Jonathan, and they want to continue to be at the forefront of things. As we see the women's game kind of start to mirror the men's game in terms of like developing some of these more offensive or modern styles of play, they want a coach that's able to not only implement it, but also counteract it in terms of like understanding how to, when other teams are playing more physical with more pace, with more size and all these other things, how do we counteract it? And the Liberty, I mean, there were so many layers to like why this season the team struggled. I mean, we look at how they went from number 1 in rebounding a year ago to 7th, I think, in the league this season. They went from being a top 3 defense last year to being about average this season. I mean, there were so many things that there were just like step backs that the team took this year that kind of resulted in looking at, okay, we want to continue to be evolving, and the game is evolving. We're seeing the women's game evolve in a lot of different ways. And Jonathan talked a little bit about like what that looks like, and we'll get into like what kind of qualities they're looking in a coach, but they just wanted a coach that would be more creative in their thinking or more proactive in the way that they're going about like game planning and scheming and being able to adjust in games. Because we also talked about like one of Sandy's downfalls, unfortunately, is, she had some problems with like her rotation and substitution. She was very conservative in the way that she used her bench, and Jonathan built this roster to be deep from 1 to 12. And they were intentional with having 12 players because they wanted to not only have players that have skill sets that maybe replicate other players, but a lot of them had different skill sets that were very versatile or different than other players, to be able to plug them into different situations. And Sandy wasn't successful necessarily this season in being able to use all these players and putting them in different situations that best fit what they could bring to the table.
Yeah, it's really interested in what you said there too. And you know this, Maddie, as long as both of us have been like covering sports, I think a lot of times when a coach gets fired, fans will sometimes say, and I understand where they're coming from to some degree, they'll be like, okay, they fell short this year. They just won the championship the year before. Sandy's being used as a scapegoat here for their problems, right? Takes
Yeah.
the pressure off of somebody else. Is that the case here, or is it just more about, hey, we're trying to push the franchise forward, or is that just to spend the liberty you're trying to put on this, and Sandy's really the scapegoat? Which one do you think it is?
I think there can be, like, a little bit of both to some degree. I mean,
Okay.
look, the way that I would say it is that change is inevitable anytime that a season does not perform to the capabilities of what you hope for.
Right.
Obviously, this was very much like a championship or bust type feeling. Everyone was very open to the fact that they thought that they had enough to win a championship. Injuries maybe hindered that, but they still felt like they had enough. And they fell short of that. And so there was this feeling at the end of the season that change was coming. What it was going to look like, nobody knew for sure. But I don't know. I say like it's a little bit of both in terms of using the word scapegoat. I don't think that Sandy is like, falling on the sword for this team by any means. I think that the writing had been on the wall for some time, and this was a very real possibility. It's part of the reason why I asked that question in the post-game press conference after game 3. It was because people around the team, not only this year but last year, knew that Sandy was on the hot seat, and I think that we're kind of seeing, you know, she she just wasn't fitting the bill of what the Liberty wanted. They want,
Mhm.
like we've mentioned, they want somebody that can implement more modern schemes, more modern styles, something more like an NBA type coach.
Yeah, it's very, and we'll get into the NBA ness of this around this that I find kind of interesting with some comments that Jonathan Kolb has said, but he did mention conversation with players, right? And listen, good front offices are going to have conversations with players, especially when they're looking to make a change like this. How much do you think player input factored in this decision? Because I only asked this because when you did ask the question after the season ending loss, Breanna Stewart pushed back on that. And she had a WTF reaction to that. So she was very
Yeah.
much like, this is gonna be crazy. Why would Sandy not be back? And there are going to be some fans that feel that way too. But how much do you think player input factored in this decision where the organization had to say, hey, to move forward, we got to get a little bit more modern? Players had to be saying something about this, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I guess going back to what Stewie said, it was more like a WTF on like asking the question in that moment, but it was also
Right.
because there was no exit interviews, and I was told you have to ask the question at the podium because she's not going to be available in the hallway. But players did voice their support for Sandy. Sandy is very well liked. I don't think I've ever heard a player speak poorly of their experience with her. She's one of
Same.
the most favorite coaches to play for in the league. That said, obviously before Jonathan makes these, it was Jonathan's decision at the end of the day. He made that very clear today during his press conference. But before he made that decision, of course, he had conversations with players. And it wasn't necessarily conversations to like get their blessing by any means, but just making sure that they're informed because like their opinion matters, but it's only one factor and in like the grand scheme of this decision, like this decision wasn't just based off of one thing, it was based off of a multitude of reasonings. And so I think that like of course he had conversations with important players, Breanna Stewart, JJ, Sabrina Ionescu. They all had to have known or been on some type of same page in understanding like why he was going to make this move and what that means for the future. And in the way that he pitched it, based off of what he told us today, it was very much about we want to be forward thinking. We want to be for future oriented type of organization. And, I had a quote that I wanted to read because
Yeah,
I
please.
thought it was, interesting in what he said. Yeah, he said that they pride themselves in being innovative and future oriented. And that's part of the reason why they made the decision. But this is a direct quote right here. This is not a results based organization. This is not about not winning or winning. It's about how do we position ourselves to be at the top of the league in a real sustainable way as the league does evolve in the ways we're talking about on the floor. And so I think when you pitch it to players like that we want to continue to be pushing this envelope, it's easy for players to get behind it. I think communication is so important. And
Yeah.
Jonathan is really good at communicating with his players.
Yeah, communication is important, right? In any job, any organization, we need to communicate with our bosses, the people we work under, about the content we put out, and all this other stuff. The word that stood out to me in that quote, Maddie, was, and he talked about this, he used this word multiple times. I saw you wrote and other people, sustainability, right? You started the word adaptability as well too, but sustainability. If you could, for the viewers and listeners, what does that actually mean in terms of style of play and roster construction as the Liberty try to move forward in the W and where it is now? What does that mean to truly be sustainable in the league? And is there a team we're looking at that? Is it the Lynx? Is it the Aces? Like, what's the sustainability look like in the W right now?
I think sustainability looks very different. It's not just like one clear definition. I think there's
Right.
sustainability in a lot of different ways. And I think some of the sustainability is what we talked about and trying to be, constantly being at the forefront of a changing game and making sure that you're the one that's really pushing the envelope and making sure that you're the one that's implementing and adopting these types of things before everyone else catches on the wagon. And so sustainability in terms of that, sustainability and in terms of constantly being a championship caliber organization, sustainability and just constantly being among the best in terms of like everything you do, from not only the game day experience, not only player relationship and player experience and what you can offer them. The Liberty have one of the most robust front offices in the WNBA in terms of just personnel. And that's something that a lot of WNBA teams are still kind of dealing with. Some WNBA teams don't have a GM and an assistant GM. Like things like that are still hampering some teams. When we look at teams that have sustained success, you can look at the Aces as a team that has sustained success in recent years. And they are a blueprint to certain degrees. I think the Lynx are kind of this anomaly of sorts in the way that they've been able to sustain success in terms of like the dynasty era and, falling off for a little bit, but then getting back on. And Cheryl Reeve, her longevity in the position. Somebody asked specifically today about like why Sandy couldn't be the Cheryl Reeve of the New York Liberty. I'm paraphrasing. It wasn't exactly phrased like that, but and I think Cheryl Reeve, she's been through a lot of ups and downs with the Lynx, but the Lynx are continually a team that is contending for championships year in and year out. A few down years bound to happen to everyone, but the Lynx are constantly in that conversation. So I think that's another team that really sets the standard in terms of just competitiveness.
Some people will say to that point that sustainability is sticking with your coach through the ups and downs, and that the Liberty could have been more sustainable had they stuck with Sandy Brondello. I think it's what you said though, Maddie, because sustainability is different. There's not just one thing across the board. I'm with you on that. I know there'll be that critique with that, but go ahead. You respond to that.
Well, I was just going to say that also in some ways the sustainability, like having Sandy stay as the head coach would be more about continuity. And that's part of the reason why they kept Sandy as the head coach this season was, they talked about looking into whether she was the coach to lead them into this season. But after winning a championship, that kind of bought her time. Right. And the way that Jonathan phrased it today was we wanted that continuity for a title defense. And so, I do think that, sustainability can mean having the same head coach, bringing back the same players and all of that. But if you're constantly doing the same thing, but expecting different results,
what do you call that? Insanity. We call that insanity.
Exactly. Right. So I think that, again, like we go back to what we were saying, change was necessary to some degree. What that change was going to look like, we had inclinations that it could be a change from the head coach, which is ultimately what they did. There's also probably going to be some personnel changes that happen this offseason.
Probably going to be there. Last thing for me on we're talking about with Kolb, the timing of this move, right? And happening just days after the season ended. Was this good? Because does this help the Liberty sort of get ahead in the coaching market? I know Jonathan Kolb talked today about there's no timeline for this right now. And you and I spoke about this the last time we recorded about, well, there's so much uncertainty with the W this offseason, so who knows? But do you like this in terms of them being able to get ahead, start making a short list or long list and interviewing candidates? Is this what's best for the organization moving forward, the fact that they got this done so quickly, rather to say?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it would be abnormal if this happen like a month from now to some
Yeah,
degree.
that's just weird.
That just would feel weird.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised that it happened a few days after a season-ending loss. I think this way it gives Sandy Brondello an opportunity to interview for other jobs, or if she wants to continue coaching in the WNBA. I know that Portland, Seattle, and uh, Toronto have all reached out to her or to gauge interest.
Hmm.
I think also, yes, it does allow the Liberty to start to move forward, start to look at candidates. They haven't hired like a search firm to kick this off, which kind of is a little bit telling that they probably have some people in mind, though
Right.
they didn't share exactly who those people might be. They're Jonathan is really good at keeping things close to vest and not showing all of his cards. And so, I think that it was the right timeline, I guess, to announce it. I There's no timeline in terms of like hiring somebody because they don't want to limit their scope of a coaching search. They want to make sure that they interview as many candidates as possible that makes sense for what they're looking for. And if we want to talk a little bit about what they're looking for, I know that we've kind of touched on it. They do like the idea of having a coach that has NBA experience. Asked today specifically whether it would be like a prerequisite for a candidate to have
Hmm.
WNBA experience. Jonathan basically said, no, it's not required,
Hmm.
which opens the door to NBA, to international, to college, like to a lot of different things. And so that kind of was really interesting to me. And so, yeah, I guess we'll see. There's no timeline.
No timeline, right? But I kind of want to move now into where you just kind of led us to with the coaching candidates and the next steps, if you would say for them, because I want to go back to the words innovative and adaptive. I'm going to keep going back to the words here that Kolb used. But I think a fair question from somebody rooting for this team, even for us covering the team, well, okay, what qualities does the next head coach have to have that meets Kolb's vision of being innovative and adaptive? What qualities do you think he might be looking for specifically that needs to be shown from this next head coach?
Yeah, part of the reason why Jonathan didn't want to state like specific qualities was because he didn't want it to get misconstrued that it meant that Sandy didn't have these qualities or whatever.
That makes sense.
Especially in a day and age of social media where things get clipped out of context and
Hmm.
people like to drum up storylines that aren't necessarily accurate or take things out of context. But so some of the qualities I'm going to list are in line with Sandy, and then some of them are also maybe different ways of approaching the game. And so, they're going to want to coach that is an expert communicator, somebody that can manage multiple personalities, because the thing on the Liberty in particular is, I mean, I would say there's a lot of like evenness in terms of like personalities and stuff, but players have egos. Players are within themselves celebrities to different degrees. They have difficult lives. Stuff happens. And you have to have a coach that can be like sympathetic, empathetic, and be able to help manage that so it does not impact like the play on the floor. And so there's that. I think that they're going to want to have a coach that can implement an offense that makes sense. Potentially having Sabrina being at the one is something that Jonathan hinted at. They're definitely considering her being a point guard next season. I think that defensively they have some other things that they're going to want to have a coach that can counteract a lot of the offense that we've already discussed. So there's a lot of different things that they're looking for in terms of the candidate that they want.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I think it's going to be very interesting. The thing that when you just said about, well, Kolb said that you just mentioned, but the fact that they don't necessarily have to be looking for somebody, Maddie, within the WNBA ecosystem. That when I read that and heard you say that made my ears perk up too, and it makes me wonder: do you think they're more likely to go with a fresh outside hire here, because since they're opening themselves up to a bunch of different possibilities in terms of the coach, and would that be good for the Liberty in their organization to get somebody in who's got maybe different ideas outside of the WNBA ecosystem?
I think so. And I think like for a long time, the WNBA was looked at a league as like a stepping stone for coaches to be able to go off and take jobs elsewhere. And now it's more of a destination. And for the Liberty in particular, you're going to a number one market with a team that has owners that have shown a willingness to invest, that has made promises to an improved player experience. They're building an $80 million practice facility. They're showing signs that they're serious about running this as a professional ship. And this might sound silly, but for a long time in the WNBA, that wasn't necessarily the case. And, we had coaches that were also the GMs, and we still have coaches that are GMs in the league, which is crazy to me. But so I think that this is a very attractive destination and job for a lot of outside people. I think that, as Jonathan said, that this is going to be a vast search. It's not going to be something that they're just going to call up the first person and that's going to be their person. They're going to probably have multiple interviews, and this is going to be a process. It's probably going to take potentially weeks, maybe even months, hopefully by the new year, potentially. I mean, it's hard to put a timeline on these things, especially because we don't necessarily know when free agency will happen, when the expansion draft will happen. Hopefully you would have a coach in line before that stuff starts to go down, just because you would want their input and what they're looking for. I love to quote that Jonathan gave about he wants to make sure that he gives his coach all the ingredients so then his coach can cook and
I like that.
play around with like different combinations and stuff like that.
Yeah, now that would be good. You want the coach to be in there before all the other stuff happens. All right, this is the thing I know people want to talk about. They want to know, okay, who are the top candidates here, Maddie? I mean, you've seen different names here, Lindsey Harding. So I'm going to give some names that have some NBA experience too, or from that ecosystem too, and even college. Niele Ivey from Notre Dame, Chrissy Tolliver was also another assistant with NBA ties. Nikki Collins, Sonia Roman, who's on the staff already as an assistant offensive coordinator. That's just a short list of names I've thrown out there. Some fans are going to clamor for Teresa Weatherspoon. You're going to hear that. What names stand out from what you're either hearing, seeing? What names as top candidates have stood out to you?
Yeah, I've talked to a few people about like different coaching candidates. So Lindsey Harding is really interesting to me. She was the coach of the Stockton Kings and was the G League coach, I think in 2023, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. Now she's an assistant on the Lakers staff.
Correct.
She's somebody that I find as an interesting candidate. I know that she was well liked by the players and was really good at adjusting to her situation. She was dealt with a hard hand of cards there. I like Nikki. I might be biased. I think that she's ready for another WNBA job. She's a great coach at Baylor. There's no necessarily indication that she's even willing to or wants to move out of that position. She has a great thing going for her there. Sonia, I mean, she's like an easy person to look at just because she was hired to join Sandy's staff last year. She didn't have any prior WNBA experience. I talked to her this season, and she even said that Zach O'Brien was really great on the Liberty staff to help her get, well adjusted to the WNBA and have a better understanding of how things are and run and look. And so she's an interesting candidate. It's really early, and so it's hard to say exactly what direction they're going. Yeah. But those are all names that I think are worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I think some names worth keeping an eye on. And I think the other thing for me too is when you look at these coaching candidates, Maddie, I'm going to take an assumption here, assuming that the current core of Stewie, JJ, and Sab are back. And Jonathan Kolb said today that it is his understanding that they all want to be back. That's what he exactly said. Do you think any of these candidates, or maybe some of the ones you mentioned, could maximize that current core? That would do a great job of helping to maximize those three players?
I think so. And I think that too, it's about maximizing and taking advantage of this championship window that you have, especially with Breanna Stewart. I know that her and Sabrina and JJ, for that matter, are all hungry to win another title. They all want to get back to that euphoria that they experienced a year ago. And it's also about making sure that you find the right pieces to surround them with. And I think that, getting Benijah back and healthy is going to be really good for the Liberty. I think we realize how important she was this season. We also realize how important Kayla Thornton was to the Liberty, who obviously was taken by the Valkyries in the expansion draft, which also brings in questions for this upcoming year. We're having 2 expansion drafts between Toronto and Portland. We do not know what that's going to look like yet because that's all tied to the CBA that is still being negotiated as we speak. And it'll be interesting because there's several players that the Liberty could potentially lose, in that situation. And so all of this is like also very fluid. I know that's not like a fun answer, but it's kind of the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
And it'll just be like interesting to see how it all plays out.
It is, and we'll get to that at some point in the offseason. Maddie and I are going to sit down and talk about what players Liberty could protect when we know when those expansion drafts are and all that stuff. It's going to be interesting because they're going to lose somebody good. They're going to likely lose somebody good, and that's very interesting about how that happens. I guess to put a bow on this, now we've got the coaching. We know the coaching change. We know Jonathan Kolb has spoken to the media and has given us the best. And I think, I got to say this. You got to give credit because not every organization in sports does this. There's some transparency as much as there can be with the fans to let them know what's going on and what the plan is. And I do think that's something that's dope and should be commended. But what is the signal to Liberty Nation about the urgency, right, to win now, to, as you just said, maximize this championship window, and bring up the word sustainable again, sustain long-term success? Is this a clear and strong message to the fans by Kolb and company?
Definitely. I mean, if there's anything that we've learned about the Kolb and the front office since he's taken over, is that they're very bullish and very aggressive. They're going to constantly be making moves to put the Liberty in the best position possible to be contending for championships. They don't want to just win the one that they had in 2024. They want more. And they've always been very clear about that messaging, that they want championships, plural, not just one. And so, if you're a fan, I mean, I think you were aware that this was a very real possibility that the Liberty could be parting ways with Sandy at the end of the season. Maybe if you're not necessarily a Liberty fan, you were a little bit shocked because you're like, wow, she just won a title a year ago. But I think that if you're a fan, you should be, I guess, excited that you have a GM that's willing to take a risk like this. Even Jonathan said he knows they need to nail this hire. He knows the importance of like who he brings in is going to be in charge of taking the Liberty and guiding them on this next chapter of the franchise. And hopefully that franchise includes winning a championship. Obviously, that's always the goal at the end of the day. And this is a winning business. It's part of the reason why, the Liberty didn't win a lot this season. And that also plays a factor into why Sandy isn't returning. So, yeah, if I'm a fan, I'm probably feeling pretty good.
Yeah, you got to be feeling good about the message. And listen, you got to feel good when your organization is saying, we want to win and we want sustained long-term success. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It feels like a pretty good message. Look, I understand.
And having sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but also having the transparency and willingness to like come out and stand on business and explain why you felt like this was necessary and what you hope the future looks like with the team. Like you got to give props where it's due in terms of that, like you kind of said, because not every organization, Knicks, do that. So
I'm going to just laugh. I'm not going to say anything else. Not everybody does that. I think organizations should do that. I think you should be transparent to your fans. Maddie, I 100% agree with you. And listen, Jonathan Kolb stood there today and answered questions.
For 40 minutes.
For 40 minutes. He wasn't ducking any smoke. He was trying to be as transparent as possible, I think as much as he could be. And I think that's all you can ask. Now, look, he's let you know what they're looking for, what their vision is. I would say that's fair to say he gave what their vision is. Not all the ingredients to that vision or all the parts of it, but he gave a good amount of what the vision is. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see it. I'm sure we'll talk, who knows, in the coming weeks or whatever about what more candidates emerge. And I know you will hear more about that. And it's going to be very interesting, but it's going to be a bit of a new era for the Liberty coaching wise. And so it'll be pretty interesting and what should be a pretty busy off season. But Maddie doesn't have to travel. She didn't have to travel for any of this. So I guess this is kind of good. That is the great Madeline Kenney, sports reporter for the New York Post. I'm Dexter Henry, another edition of Liberty Lately. Maddie, I appreciate you. We'll do this again. I want to say soon, but I don't know. We'll do this when there's more news for sure.